I got some little tales and pictures today about those situations where people just keep on driving, and then I got a few other little items thrown in here too. So I'm going to jump into this thing and see what I can tell you guys. This 2007 Honda Element was one that my oldest son bought when it was nearly new, and then he sold it to his nephew, who is my youngest son's oldest boy. And he had been noticing some noise, and so when he finally got it to his, he was the same one I posted a picture of, the red-headed boy that was working on his power windows. But he said, hey, my brakes are making some noise. And it turned out that this particular, the brake pad was completely gone. You can see right here, it's dreadful. There was no brake pad left at all, and the caliper was just scrubbing on there, and it had blown the caliper. But that wheel was the only one. In other words, the one on the other side didn't do anything like this. And he bought a caliper which came with the bracket and everything, replaced the caliper, the rotor, and the the pads obviously and all that, and then they had to bleed the brakes and all that. But anyway, that was just one of those things. Now you guys have seen brakes worn out this bad. It's really amazing that these brakes on these vehicles are designed so that they work. They'll stop the car even if they've got some really serious problems. Typically, you're going to have a very, very, very serious problem if the brakes totally fail, because they got two chambers in the master cylinder, and even if one, some of them are crisscrossed the way they're piped and all that, some of them are front and rear, but they're designed so that they can stop, that it'll still stop the car even if something happens. Back in the day when they made Hudson automobiles, they had a mechanical backup in case the hydraulics failed, which I thought, they were being forward thinking about that, but I don't think anybody else has done that. Your older Model Ts and stuff just had mechanical brakes anyway, they didn't even use hydraulics for that. Well, this is a different ride. It's an Element that belonged to my doctor's daughter, and his other daughter, one of his younger daughters, was actually in my automotive program, and she said, can I bring this 2008 Element that we've got that belongs to my sister. My dad started driving it, and he says the brakes were noisy. After it'd been sitting there for months, he decided, well, I need to drive this, don't let it sit there. So when he started driving it, he noticed noisy brakes. So he carries it to the Honda dealer. I don't know who worked on it or what their deal was or anything like that. This has been years ago. So anyway, they said, well, we're going to have to rebuild all of your brakes because you've been riding the brake and you've destroyed your brakes and it's not under warranty. And he says, I don't buy that. And they said, well, that's the way it is. We're going to have to charge you $1,000 to rebuild all your brakes. And so his daughter asked, could she bring it to us? I said, sure, bring it on over. We'll have a look at it. The only thing that was wrong with it was the rear rotors were rusty, and he was hearing that rust. Nothing wrong with the brakes as far as being worn out. Well, at the same time, there was another guy who was a college employee, one of the maintenance men, and he had his vehicle in there, and we were working on his brakes at the same time. And he wanted brakes put on his, and so I think rear brakes, he wanted rear brakes, and this was rear brakes too. And so I had the brake pads in the vise, and we were, using a file on them a little bit to get rid of this rusty crud that had, become embedded in the lining. And we put new brakes. We machined the rotors and put new brake pads on the college employee's Chrysler. But he happened to walk by and saw us filing the brake pads for this Honda Element. And whenever I presented the bill to him for the brake pads we put on his Chrysler, which we legitimately did, he says, no, I'm not going to pay that because you didn't put brakes on my car. I said, what are you talking about? He said, I saw you filing those pads over there. I said, those were for this other vehicle, they weren't for yours. And he just flatly refused to pay that bill because he swore up and down we didn't do the work. I mean, the thing about it is, and I never made another work order for that guy, because there's some people you just can't do business with. I mean, I got along with a guy okay like that, but I wouldn't make any more work orders for him. But those situations there's a couple of things that went on there. We had a guy that went to the Honda place and got jerked around, and they tried to charge him $1,000 for brake work he didn't need. And then whenever we were doing his brake work, this other customer that I had there at the shop, at the college shop, tried to act like we were trying to put the screws to him. So anyway, that was just a fruit basket turnover.
These brakes here
the drum brake
have
check.
got a leak of some kind, so they're all sooty and
when you're
wet.
checking the brakes. These brakes
So we're going to clean those off too.
Anyway,
we probably have
wheel cylinder.
a leaking wheel cylinder over there. That's not too hard to
troubleshoot. Nearly as bad as far as
he's got to have some wheel cylinders, we can rebuild those. And he's got to have brake pads. You can see these brake pads are just about worn down to the rivets anyway. So we're going to measure the brake drum. And we're going to see if it's too big. If it's not, we're going to machine the brake pads. Pretty good deal here. This one here looks really good. Pull the rubber back there.
You don't see any fluid.
We don't see any blown wheel cylinder there, but we are going to have to wash the dust off of
these. To the wise, you know. Check the wheel cylinder every time. This one here came in. I mean, it had a noise right after somebody had put some brake pads on it. And you can see what they did here. This right here should have been, this part right here, see this curved piece right here, that should have been in here. And they put the pads in backwards. They had to work to do this. But whenever it was against the rotor hat, you know, the hat part of the rotor, which is this part right here, it was scrubbing right here really bad. It was making a terrible racket. And I mean, I guess eventually it could have machined that away so that the disc part of it would have been a different part than the hub, and there could have been an issue with that. Now, this friend of mine had a Camry that he had some people that he knew that owned a tire shop, and they always did his brakes. They just kept machining the rotors every time, and he had a lot of miles on his car, like 285,000 miles on it. And they had machined the rotor to where it was thin enough to where when his pads wore down finally that last time, he mashed the brakes once and he had good brakes, and he mashed the brakes a second time and the pads just shot out of there and suddenly he had no brakes. Now that was a catastrophic brake fail, and he almost drove under a semi that he was pulling into a yield lane, and this semi truck was there and he almost went under it, but he had to go off on the grass. But he wound up needing rotors. But that's one of the reasons also it's a good idea to measure the thickness of the rotors, and if it's below the specified thickness, you need to go ahead and replace the rotors instead of machining them. So that's just, you know, another thing. Now here's a couple of brake stories. Same owner got a set of Autocraft gold pads from Advance. Machined the rotors, replaced the pads, did the 15-15-15 brake burnishing process. That's 15 stops for 15 from, let's see, 15 stops from 15 miles an hour with 15-second to cool down or whatever, you know, that's what they call that. I mean, Bendix you can look that up on Bendix. You're burnishing the brake pads is what you're doing. And it takes about 30 minutes to do it, but you're basically wanting to do just a normal stop. You're not going to slide the wheels or nothing like that. You're just trying to get the brake pads burnished in there so that they're seated to the rotors, which the rotors are supposed to have a non-directional finish on them. Like you would ordinarily have, you know. If you're somebody that machines rotors, Bendix also says you need to wash the rotors with soap and water when you're done. And we always like to put a little circular sanding pad while the thing was still on the rotor machine, and, you know, make that non-directional finish, then wash the rotors, then put them on there and put the pads on there. We did everything the same way on both of this lady's vehicles. She owned this 08 Titan, and she owned an 07 Escalade. Whenever we put these pads on that Escalade, though, and we did everything the same way on both vehicles, she came back about 3 weeks later, and there's heavy black brake dust all over the sides of her Escalade. I mean, you could write your name in it. It was just awful. Now, it's amazing it didn't happen on the white one, even though we bought the pads from the same place, although they could have come from a different vendor to the Autocraft people. You know, CarQuest is now the people that have produce the pads for Advance. That's our kind of joined at the hip. But the point is, we had to clean all of that up and replace the pads again on this Escalade to get rid of that dust problem, which is the craziest thing I've ever seen. Now, they make pads that make less dust than others, and everybody's seen brake dust on wheels and this kind of thing. But the simple fact is, I've never before or since seen one that dusted the whole sides of the vehicle the way these did. It was just totally amazing to me. This was a sudden failure on a Toyota Camry that could have killed the car. It just busted that hose. Now, see, if you might want to look at this, looking at this hose from the outside, it looks pretty good, doesn't it? It doesn't look that bad from the outside. Now, a lot of times you can squeeze the hose and you can feel that it really needs to be replaced just because of the way it feels. But this particular one, without warning, just popped like you see right here, and it came in like that. And I think I had mentioned that one time before. I had that guy that had that same Camry that I was talking about with the brake pad shot out of there a while ago because they got thin enough, and the rotors were too thin. Anyway, he called me from about 10 miles away and said he was on the way and the car had overheated, and I went and the radiator had split like the Camrys like to do across the top of the radio, get a horizontal split in that plastic tank. And I would have sworn it had a blown head gasket because it was making that, you know, sickly sweet steam coming in, puffing out of the radiator and all. We got it towed over to the shop, and whenever I wanted to show that to the students, it wouldn't act like it had a blown head gasket at all. So I don't know if the head gasket, you know, was, I mean, if the head warped a little bit and then went back into shape, or I don't know what happened there, but I would have sworn in a court of law when I was out there at that little country store where the thing had broke down, and I'd have sworn that he had a blown head gasket, but apparently he didn't. And we put a radiator in that thing, bled it out, and he drove it for years after that. This was dangerous. I was working under the hood of this trainer vehicle that we had. It was a 97 Pontiac Grand Prix that somebody had donated to the college. That was kind of funny too, because she gave us the title and she had signed the back of the title. And I sent it over to the business office. The ladies at the business office sent it back and said, "We can't use this." I said, "What are you talking about?" She says, "Well, she signed her name on the back of the title, but she didn't print it." Really? So I let it lay on my desk for a day or two, and then I printed her name on the title and I sent it back to her. You know, sometimes people can't get past something, you know. Anyway, so I was working on this thing. It was really, really a hot day. The engine was really hot, and I saw this swelled up hose right here. I mean, this right here is downright scary. It was like a balloon. And as soon as I saw that, I backed off. And I told everybody to stay away from that car. I shut the engine off, I let it cool down, and we put a radiator hose on that car. But imagine what would have happened if this thing had split and sprayed water all over me. Can you imagine how hot that coolant would have been? You know, because coolant actually, because of the fact that it's got coolant in it, will be hotter than water. That's like that. And it was under pressure too, so I mean, that would have been like second and third degree burns right there. And anyway, that's a scary thing too. So pay attention when you're working around these things. You don't want to get burned. And you know, also don't ever check a cooling system when it's hot, because it's liable to have pressure built up in there, and that's just never a good thing. One of the things on the old conventional radiator caps that they made that a lot of people use was those lever vent caps, where you could pull up this lever and release the pressure before you ever took the cap off. That wasn't a bad idea, really.
Be shaking
now,
like that.
Here's a wore-out water pump syndrome.
Well,
you see this whole that bearing is shot, and then here's another one. It's a worn-out water pump that was on a 5.3 liter Chevy of some, you know, early 2000s thing, and it had been leaking for a long time. You can see this calcium crud all over the place, and I just basically turned the water pump over and laid it on the bench so I could take a good picture of that. That's pretty good. There was a guy one time that emailed me from South Africa, and he was a Brit. He's a guy from Britain. I could even tell by the way he typed. He typed with a British accent, if you can believe that. And he had a Mercedes that he said that the water pump was leaking on it, and he said there was a kit available to rebuild the water pump, but he didn't have the money to buy it. He didn't have the money to buy a water pump. And I asked him if the bearing was worn out, like you're seeing on this one over here. And he says, you know, that bearing right there was worn out. Interestingly enough, the bearing can be worn out like that and it not be leaking. Well, that's interesting too. But he says, no, it's not leaking. I mean, he says it's leaking, but the bearing is fine. It's really tight. And so I told him about an old filling station trick where you add a little bit of brake fluid to the radiator. And if that thing's dripping, when you add a little brake fluid to the radiator, you can watch that thing while it's running when you add that brake fluid, and it will begin to soften that seal, and it will stop leaking, usually. Now, I will tell you, if there's been a lot of flakes of rust and stuff in the cooling system, and it has shredded the seal with those flakes of rust, this won't work. Furthermore, once it stops leaking, what you got to do right then is shut it down, drain all the coolant and all the stuff out of it, and put fresh antifreeze back in it, because if you just leave the brake fluid in there, it'll keep softening the seal to where it'll start leaking worse. So if you do this thing where you pour a little brake fluid in there and watch it stop leaking, not any real danger there, but keep a close check on your coolant. You know, particularly it's really easy if you got one of them coolant bottles. But if you're going to drain it and refill it, make sure you know how to get all the air out of it. It's not like pouring water in a bucket. You know, you got to make sure that it's burped out and there's no air trapped in the block and all that kind of stuff. And that was really hard to teach because some students didn't seem to understand that.
Move the belt
Here's
so I can see
a Volkswagen Beetle that's got a worn out water pump. My problem here was I couldn't get the guy to put his hand down there and move that pulley so I could see the pulley.
Yeah, I can't reach
So
it.
see, here I was reaching down there trying to do something with it, and I couldn't make it happen. Oh, there we go. He figured it out. See that wore out thing, so we had to put a timing belt and water pump on that and all that kind of thing on that little small Beetle. That was a cool little ride. Now this right here was a '69 F100. And it was, and we basically saved this engine. And hold on a second, that ought to play a video right there. There we go. There's the video playing. And the guy that he was actually the pastor of my church. And his aunt had his old '69 F100 sitting in the barn, and it ran bad and it made noise. It clattered and everything. And he says, "Can you do anything with this as far as rebuilding the motor?" And I said, well, yeah, I guess. And I think there was probably a lot of sound playing right there while I was trying to talk. So what I was saying was my pastor brought this because his aunt had it in her barn and it was clattered and making a lot of racket. And so what we wound up doing was replacing the lifters, and we replaced the push rods, and we got it all put all together. We resealed the side cover and the valve cover. We adjusted the valves, which on this one you have to adjust the valves kind of like you do on a Chevy. You know, so after we got the valves adjusted and everything, the only problem he had was it had this great big old huge steering wheel and it didn't have power steering, and it was aggravating to steer it. And he asked about getting power steering put on there. And if you look for a power steering kit to put power steering on a vehicle like this that doesn't have one, you are going to pay through the nose. There are electric power steering kits, there are hydraulic power steering kits. There's a fair amount of work and it's really expensive and all that. But anyway, they were really happy to get this old. We also replaced the fuel tank sending unit, and which is the fuel tank right behind the seat inside the cab on these older trucks like this. Now this one right here needs a bunch of work, you know. Think about this. All this wobbling and wibbling. If you see one like that, it's typically going to be a bearing. If it's ball joints, when you grab it at the top and the bottom, you're going to see it move. And if it's tie rod ends, you grab it right here and you're going to see it move. But if it's moving all over the place, it's either got really bad ball joints and really bad tie rod ends, or the bearing is shot. And this was on a vehicle that we looked at for one of the instructors over there, and we wound up having to put a bearing on it. Now, nobody's going to get excited if they find a 2006 Honda Ridgeline sitting in a barn, but you find an old square body Chevy or something like that sitting in a barn. That is really exciting. I don't know if this guy found this one sitting in a barn, but I saw it last Wednesday. He had an underinflated tire. That was one of the first things I noticed. His tire right here was about half flat. Incidentally, what a lot of people don't realize, a tire can be half inflated. Like if it's supposed to have 32 pounds, it can have 16 pounds in it and still look fairly good if you're just standing there looking at it. That's why you need to check it with air pressure. This one right here, I bet it was down to 5 pounds. This old boy was driving it, but it was a cool looking truck. I obliterated his license number by putting 1975 on there, but in reality, from 73 till about 77, I think the truck pretty much looked like this on the rear. The grill was what changed. But these tail lights right here, I don't know if you've ever noticed it or not, but you can buy tail lights like this and from aftermarket sources, and I've actually seen them at the parts store. If you ever have to have a tail light for something like this. There was a early 60s model Chevrolet pickup that this local farmer had. It was a black one. And I noticed that his red tail light covers were always gone off of his truck. And his name was Sherman. I said, Sherman, how come you don't ever have any red taillight covers on your stoplights and stuff? He says, well, when I drive it into the hog pen, the hogs eat them off there. I don't know why, but they notice those red covers and they chew those covers off. It was just round tail lights that just kind of were mounted on the side of the truck like on those older trucks they had. I thought that was funny. Now this idle air control system, I mean, whenever you can see how the air, this is the bottom of that throttle body, when the air comes from above these throttle plates. But when they're closed, in order to control the idle, the engine controller uses a stepper motor that's got 4 wires going to it. Now, Chrysler and Jeep and GM and everybody that uses these 4-wire stepper motors have an entirely different way of operating those motors, so they're not all the same. Even though they may have a connector that plugs in, you know, to more than one of them, you got to make sure you're using the right one or you'll burn something up. Anyway, this one here, it turns this little, there's a little screw in here that is connected to this. It's got threads on it, and there's threads on the inside of that motor, and this thing can turn that motor in steps, you know, just 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and whenever it does that, it moves this pintle out and in very carefully. You can actually plug in another stepper motor while the engine's running and hold your finger over the end of that thing, and it'll move with you holding your thumb against it, which is pretty cool. You can actually see if it's working. I mean, if the circuits are working that way. But anyway, that pintle, when it opens up, see, it lets air go around the throttle plate, which this one right here, the air would be coming from above, and it would go around the throttle plate, and it would go into the cylinders in an equal, you know, both sides get an equal amount of air, and that's how that stepper motor works. Anytime you run air around the throttle plate, if you've got a, you know, when you've got electronic throttle control, you don't need that because the throttle plate can actually move. You don't need a cruise control servo if you've got electronic throttle control. I actually just put when I bought my 2007 F-150, I just put a set of buttons on the dash, and now watch this, and I actually was able to tell with the laptop I had cruise, and then I had cruise. But look at that wobbler, that wobbling tire. When I see one like that, I like to take a little video of it. That was one I was riding behind one day. And here's another wobbler. See that?
Okay, that's all right. I appreciate it.
Hub is work. That thing's going to have a hub for that reason. They went against a curb or something on that one. Now this one right here, sometimes I'll take a walk through our neighborhood. I'll just make a circle, you know, like a 15-minute walk, you know, whenever I've had a big lunch or something. And I can do that because I'm retired, you see. But this thing right here is a stud and a Monstah, this Blazer. This thing looks like a really nice beach ride, and I thought it was really cool with the big old fat tires on it. I will tell you this though, if you ever work with big old fat tires like that, it's not easy to balance them. You know, my dad driving his little Volkswagen Rabbits that he used to drive and everything, he would just have tires put on it and tell him not even to worry about balancing them, and he would never have any trouble. One time his truck was started shaking going down the road, and he got out with a pair of pliers and took all the weights off the tires, and it ran real smooth after that. But I'm not telling you not to balance your tires, but you know, just whatever works for you. Now, they replaced the fuel pump on this Pontiac, Montana. Somebody did. It came to us and said, hey, we had the fuel pump replaced and it still wouldn't work. So we got out there and unplugged the relay, and it was about confused us a little bit because I used my method. Unplug the relay, find the wire that's going out to the pump, put a test light connected to the hot side of the battery terminal, touch it to the terminal going out to the pump, kick the gas tank, see if the light comes on. When we did, it came on. So we went ahead and dropped the tank, looked at the pump. There's nothing wrong with the connections with the pump or anything like that. But this connector right here that you're looking at is actually in the top of the left-hand wheel well, right there where all that salt splash and road splash and everything happened, and it was the problem. Now, a lot of GMs in the 2000s, in the mid, you know, like 2000 to 2010 roughly, and all that kind of stuff, would have this connector going through the body to the outside. You know, Cobalts have it in the back, right in kind of the middle, but not in a wheel well. But whoever decided to put this one in the wheel well made a bad choice. And I don't know if I ever saw another one of these, but I couldn't imagine that it not being a problem on just about all of them. But this is what we found on that one. Now this we injected some dye in this one here and cranked it. If you do that and you let it drip, you see dye coming out the evaporator drain, which is what we saw here. We wound up, this was in a Grand Cherokee, a red one. We wound up having to put an evaporator core in this one here to take care of the leak on that one. Of course, anytime you're putting the evaporator core in, it's a good idea to replace the liquid line, which will have the orifice tube in it, and it's not a bad idea to put an accumulator or a dryer, you know, depending on what kind of vehicle you're working on. Now, when the National Highway Transmission Safety Association, Administration changed car bumpers in '73, that was an interesting thing. A lot of you guys probably remember when they went from really looking cool like this to looking like this. Now, what their whole deal was, they wanted the warning lights to be able to work even after a minor crash. In other words, the stoplights, the turn signals, and all this stuff, they wanted those to still be able to work. And so they needed these things to be able to handle this lasted, well, even until now, but Ford was using these shock bumpers way on up into the 80s. You know, some of your early Tempos had those, and they would handle an 8-mile-an-hour, you know, collision. These were supposed to handle like 2.5 miles an hour or something like that if you ran into something. And they had these shocks on there. I found these on eBay, this picture of these on eBay. Somebody had refurbished these, and it didn't take long before somebody snapped them up because they wanted to put new ones on there. I was driving an 81 Mercury Lynx one time and sitting at a traffic signal in Panama City, and the car behind me got rear-ended by a Pontiac that shoved that car into the back of my car hard enough to where it damaged my driver's seat. All the change that I had in little pockets on the dash came out. The rear view mirror came off the windshield. But when I got out and looked at it, these bumper shocks kept any damage at all from happening to the outside of the car. That was a heavy-duty collision too. Now, if the guy that hit the car behind me had hit me instead of the car behind me, I would have suffered some damage. But that car behind me was shoved hard into the back of that little Mercury Lynx station wagon I was driving. And boy, was that ever a big surprise, and I did not see that coming. But what they later did was they put soft noses on there. You might notice nowadays they got soft bumpers, and they got styrofoam behind them. They got stuff like that. Instead of putting these expensive, heavy chrome bumpers and heavy bumper braces, you know, emission controls meant they had to, you know, reduce the weight of the car, and they started making more parts of the car out of aluminum and plastic and that kind of thing. And so the reason that these bumper shocks went away was they were able to satisfy it without putting shock absorbers on the bumper. Now, one of the problems that first responders had was if one of these cars was in a car fire, these things right here could cook off right here. And there's videos on there, if you look that up. They can cook off, and they can blast that bumper off that car and throw it 150 feet. And they can take somebody out. That's why a lot of times the firefighters were told not to approach the vehicle from the front or the rear if it had bumper struts on both ends of it, but come at it from a 45-degree angle, so that if that thing cooked and it blew the bumper off, it wouldn't take your legs out from under you. But anyway, it's really better to have the little soft nose. You know, Corvettes use the soft nose. They never did put these bumper shocks on theirs. They just made a soft nose on the Corvettes back in these days. This 91 4.3 liter quit while driving. And you see this little guide, there's a little guide right here. You can't hardly tell the shape of this, but it's got little, these little things here come out in here like that. See that? On both sides, it comes out, and it went out like that. And this timing chain's got a lot of stretch in it. But the simple fact was that timing chain had flopped around enough until it had machined these side pieces off. And you can see where it fell, and it actually rode all the way around the timing chain and got molded before it came up. And of course, when it did that, it basically stripped the plastic teeth off the top gear, and the thing quit. And so we had to put a timing chain on it. Fortunately, they didn't bend any valves. But when I was looking around for an illustration of this unit like we had seen on this, I found out that you can get, I think it looks to me like from Home Depot, you can buy the material to build a timing chain, which is the wackiest thing I've ever heard. And you can also supposedly buy timing chains from Home Depot. I don't understand all I know about that, because timing chains are so much different for so many vehicles. It's not just like any, one size fits all timing chain thing. Well, I'm going to go back to work, building some more stuff here, and I'll see you guys next week. And I really appreciate you coming by and watching my videos, and I love your comments. And we'll see you next time.